The winter air in the whispering woods did not just chill the skin. It possessed a heavy physical weight that pressed against the chest, stealing breath before it could properly form. Nellie Vance moved through the dense, snow-laden pines with the unhurried caution of a servant avoiding notice. She kept her head lowered, her pale gaze tracking the frozen deer paths that wound away from the towering stone walls of Vaughan Fortress. Under the grey, bruised light of the early morning, the forest was a monochrome painting of heavy frost and dark bark. The only sound in the endless woods was the faint, rhythmic crunch of her thin leather boots breaking the crust of the snow. She paused beside a massive ancient cedar, reaching out to scrape a thick bead of wild pine sap from the rough trunk. As she worked, Nellie adjusted a frayed wool glove over her left hand, tugging the fabric higher over her wrist. There was a ragged hole in the thumb, a small imperfection that allowed the biting frost to seep directly into her raw skin. Her joints ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm, a constant reminder of the brutal northern season. She did not curse the cold. Down in the drafty stone cellars where the servants slept, winter was simply another fact of survival. Warmth was a luxury reserved for the high-ranking wolves who gathered around the roaring, honey-scented hearths of the upper levels. Nellie slipped the hardened amber sap into her woven foraging basket. It already held a meager collection of winter mint leaves, their edges curled and brittle from the deep freeze. The fortress apothecaries demanded these raw ingredients to brew heavy cough syrups for the lower quarters, yet none of the official healers would risk their own comfort to harvest them. Nellie had volunteered willingly. The deep woods offered a profound, unbroken quiet. Out here, there were no sharp reprimands, no sneering beat us, and no sudden bursts of pack dominance to navigate. She possessed no royal lineage, no pack rank, and no wealth to her name. Her only currency was invisibility. The high lords and elegant ladies of the court looked right through her, seeing nothing more than a mop, a bucket, or a basket of herbs. Kneeling in the snow, she used a small iron knife to pry a cluster of stubbornly rooted wintermint from the frozen soil, letting the sharp, medicinal scent of the bruised leaves clear her lungs. A sudden, unnatural flash of colour shattered the endless grey landscape. Nellie froze immediately, her knife hovering inches above the soil. Her heart performed a slow, heavy calibration of the surrounding threat, but she did not stand up or gasp. Instead, she pressed her back against the frozen bark of the cedar, letting her drab grey cloak blend seamlessly into the shadows of the tree line. Down in the shallow valley below her position, a small figure was tumbling through the deep, untrammeled snowdrifts. It was a child wrapped in a vivid, heavy red velvet coat lined with thick black fur. Nellie recognized the deep crimson fabric instantly. It belonged to Prince Leo Vaughan, the 5-year-old royal heir to the territory. The boy was miles away from the secure, heavily guarded inner courtyards of the fortress. He was completely alone. In the far distance, carried on the bitter northern wind, Nellie could hear the faint, panicked shouting of the royal guards. The heavy clanking of their armor echoed off the wrong ridge, their frantic voices growing increasingly distant as they searched the western slopes. The young prince had somehow slipped their perimeter, wandering deep into the treacherous eastern boundary. Leo appeared entirely oblivious to the panic he had caused. He was utterly absorbed in his own solitary game. The boy hopped erratically through the deep powder, lifting his knees high and dropping his mittened hands to the ground, perfectly mimicking the bounding, nervous path of a wild snow hare. Every time he landed heavily in a drift, a burst of bright, innocent laughter escaped his throat. The sound puffed into small, fragile clouds of white steam against the freezing air, dissipating almost instantly into the vast winter silence. Nellie watched the royal heir with a tight, calculating dread settling in her chest. The whispering woods were no place for a vulnerable cub. The ancient pines grew close together, casting long, deceptive shadows that hid steep ravines and frozen, jagged rocks. Worse, the outer borders were notoriously wild, stalked by starving winter predators and rogue factions who cared nothing for the golden seal of Vaughan Fortress. Yet the young prince continued his joyful, erratic dance, turning in circles to watch the snowflakes catch on his dark eyelashes. She tightened her grip on the handle of her woven basket, the logical, survival-driven instinct that had kept her alive for years screamed at her to step back into the shadows. She needed to slip away, return silently to the servant corridors, and let the heavily armed guards locate their wandering charge. A low-ranking servant had no business interfering with the Alpha King's son, but as Leo let out another delighted giggle, falling backward into a pristine snowbank and waving his arms to make an angel in the powder, Nellie found her boots, refusing to turn back toward the castle. The stark contrast between his innocent, unburdened play and the deadly reality of the frozen woods rooted her in place, her breath catching in a quiet cloud of frost. A person who spent their life scrubbing cold stone floors, folding royal garments, and pressing clean linens learned to read the subtle topography of their environment, and Nellie Vance applied that same quiet, unrelenting scrutiny to the forest. She watched the heavy tracks of the snow hare, noting the deep indentations where its hind legs pushed off the icy crust. She watched the erratic, joyful boot prints of Prince Leo Vaughan following the hare, his small frame stumbling but determined. But her eyes, trained by years of anticipating the hidden hazards of the keep, moved past the running boy, scanning the immediate trajectory of his chase. 10 yards ahead of the prince, the natural architecture of the forest floor abruptly failed. Pine needles did not naturally mound in perfect overlapping circles. When the bitter northern wind blew through the territories, it scattered debris in chaotic, elongated drifts against the bases of the ancient trunks. The patch of needles directly in the royal heir's path was completely wrong. The snow dusted over it was too loose, too powdery, lacking the hardened, crystalline crust of the surrounding undisturbed terrain. It was the careful, deliberate work of a human hand that had hastily brushed the snow over a buried hazard. Nellie stilled, her breath catching in the back of her throat. She understood the geometry of hidden things. She had spent years making herself small, recognizing when a room was dangerous before the first word was spoken. Now, the quiet forest was radiating that same lethal tension. Her gaze narrowed, cutting through the harsh glare of the morning sun, reflecting off the ice. Beneath the edge of the unnatural pine mound, a shadow caught the light incorrectly. It was not the dull organic brown of wet wood or the flat grey of frozen stone. It was the sharp, manufactured gleam of dark iron. Beside it, barely concealed by a dusted fern leaf, was the thick, rusted link of a heavy chain anchored deeply around the root system of a massive oak tree. Worse than the iron was the faint, unmistakable shimmer along the inner rim of the buried shape. Silver. The certainty lodged in her chest like a splinter of ice. It was a poacher's trap. Not a simple wire snare meant for rabbits or winter foxes, but a massive, outlawed device built with thick, coiled springs and lined with silver-plated teeth, designed to hold and severely burn a shifting wolf. It was the kind of brutal, toxic machinery that greedy rogues placed near the fortress borders for illicit bounties. The silver was meant to poison the bloodstream immediately, paralyzing the victim through sheer, blinding agony. And a 5-year-old child, laughing into the biting wind as his red coat flared behind him, was running directly toward its hidden jaws. Leo did not read the woods. He only saw the hare. If she stepped out of her designated role, if she dared to physically grab the Alpha King's son without formal permission. The administrative punishment could be severe. The calculation took less than a second. Nellie let go of her woven willow basket, It hit the frozen ground with a dull, hollow thud, tipping onto its side. The hard-earned winter mint spilled across the white crust of the snow. Her heavy boots crushed the scattered leaves as she pivoted, and the sharp, medicinal scent of bruised mint exploded into the freezing air, immediately masking the ambient scent of the pine. It was a visceral, olfactory marker of the exact moment she abandoned her lifelong invisibility. She did not shout. Shouting would only startle the young prince, perhaps causing him to stumble backward into a different hazard, or worse, freeze in place right above the iron springs. Instead, she pushed her body into a desperate, frantic sprint. The cold northern wind bit fiercely into her lungs with every inhalation, tasting of ozone and crushed herbs. The snow dragged at the heavy hem of her coarse woolen skirt, resisting her forward momentum. Her boots broke through the icy crust, the jarring impact sending dull shockwaves up her shins. But she did not slow down. She fixed her entire focus on the rapidly shrinking distance between the boy's small, red-coated figure and the unnatural mound of pine needles. She was nobody. She possessed no royal blood, no elevated rank, and no physical strength to fight a poacher if one emerged from the dark tree line. But as the gap closed, she realized she was the only body positioned between the prince and the silver teeth. The pack hierarchy, the rigid rules of the fortress, the fear of the sovereign's wrath, all of it dissolved entirely into the singular, overriding necessity of keeping a child's flesh away from toxic metal. Leo's foot lifted, his small boot hovering just inches above the concealed trigger plate of the trap. He was still smiling, his cheeks flushed with the thrill of the chase, completely oblivious to the lethal mechanism waiting beneath the loose powder. Nellie did not brace for the impact. She simply threw her entire weight forward, launching herself through the freezing air in a blind, horizontal lunge, aiming directly for the prince. She's collided with him in a tangle of limbs and heavy fabric. Her hands closed firmly around the thick wool of Prince Leo's red coat as her momentum became a desperate, uncoordinated shove. The small prince tumbled backward, lifted off his feet by the sheer force of her impact, landing safely in the center of a deep, soft snowdrift, entirely clear of the disturbed mound of pine needles. But physics demanded a brutal toll. As the child flew out of the danger zone, her own forward motion dragged her right leg directly into the hidden center of the poacher's snare. She felt the mechanical shift a fraction of a second before the impact. The trigger plate of the outlawed device gave way under the worn leather of her soul. The heavy iron springs, tensioned by Garrick Brand, a man who hunted exclusively for illicit profit, released with a dull, heavy thud that seemed to echo through the roots of the forest. The massive jaws of the silver-toothed trap slammed shut. They caught her ankle just above the joint. The heavy, silver-plated teeth punched through the thick-boiled wool of her winter stockings, gripping her limb with immovable force. The sheer kinetic shock of the rusted irons snapping together sent a violent tremor up her leg, forcing all the air from her lungs in a sharp gasp. For one solitary, merciful second, there was only an icy, detached numbness. She collapsed into the snow, staring blankly at the ugly contrivance of rusted metal now permanently locked around her ankle. Then the true nature of the snare introduced itself. The rogue poacher had not merely designed the iron to hold an animal in place. He had lined the inner rims of the jagged teeth with unrefined silver, a highly toxic element to anyone carrying even a trace of the northern shifter bloodline. The moment the metal made direct contact with her skin, the cold numbness vanished. It was instantly replaced by a searing, unnatural heat. The horrific burn radiated upward, forcing her vision to flash with blinding white static. The sheer temperature of the reaction caused the surrounding snow to hiss, sending a faint wisp of metallic-smelling steam into the freezing air. The trap was overwhelmingly heavy, a dead weight that pinned her firmly to the frozen earth. The instinct to scream was absolute. It clawed its way up her throat, fueled by a primal panic that demanded she tear the burning iron away, but voiceless endurance was her deeply ingrained coping mechanism. She had spent her entire life learning how to swallow her own voice, how to remain entirely invisible when the high lords of the court walked past. That deeply conditioned reflex was the only thing that saved them now. Before the agonizing sound could break past her lips, she shoved the thick, coarse wool of her own sleeve directly into her mouth. She bit down with crushing, desperate force. The rough fabric tore against her teeth, filling her mouth with the taste of wet wool. A low, guttural vibration shuddered deep inside her chest, tearing at her vocal cords, but no outward cry escaped into the frozen woods. Her lungs burned fiercely for oxygen as she squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the violent tremors that shook her shoulders. A few feet away, Leo scrambled awkwardly out of the snowdrift. The boy's bright red coat was dusted with white powder, his small crown of dark hair mussed from the fall. He stared at her, his wide, childish eyes locking onto the heavy iron jaws pinning her down. His bottom lip trembled violently. A high, terrified whimper broke from his small chest, the clear precursor to a full, echoing wail of absolute panic. If the royal heir screamed, the noise would carry for miles across the dead quiet of the frozen valley. It would undoubtedly draw the rogue poachers much faster than the king's border patrols. The kind of men who set illegal, silver-laced traps for profit would not hesitate to silence a lowly maid and a vulnerable royal child isolated in the woods. She could not let the boy make a single sound. Spitting the ruined wool from her mouth, she forced her jaw to unclench. She dragged a shallow, ragged breath of freezing air into her burning lungs, meticulously flattening her expression into a mask of complete calm. She absolutely refused to look down at her trapped leg. Instead, she locked her gaze entirely on the frightened child, projecting an aura of quiet control. "Little cub," she whispered. Her voice was strained, decidedly thinner than usual, but entirely steady. It was not a plea for help, but a calm, grounding command. "Look at me," the small boy hiccuped, heavy tears spilling over his flushed cheeks, but he obeyed the quiet authority in her tone. He took a hesitant, trembling step forward, his small hands reaching out, as if he meant to try and pull the heavy iron springs apart himself. "No, stay right there," she breathed out, offering him a tight, reassuring smile that required every ounce of her willpower to maintain. "Do not touch the metal. We are going to play a game." He stopped, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He sniffled, wiping his nose with the back of a thick velvet glove. "It is a very important game," she continued, forcing her tone into the quiet, rhythmic cadence she normally used when organizing the dusty ledgers in the archive rooms. "It is called the Sleeping Wolf. Do you know it?" He shook his head frantically, his small fists balling at his sides. The silver poison was climbing higher up her calf now, sending violent, involuntary spasms through her thigh. Cold sweat beaded heavily on her forehead, instantly freezing in the biting northern wind. Her vision began to tunnel, the dark edges of the pine forest bleeding into a fuzzy grey haze. "To win the game, you must crouch down in the snow, exactly where you are," she coaxed, her voice dropping to a delicate, melodic hum that completely masked her agonizing pain. "You tuck your chin to your chest, you close your eyes tightly, and you do not make a single sound. You become completely invisible." The young boy looked from her pale, sweating face to the terrifying trap, his instincts warring between panic and obedience. "If you stay perfectly quiet, the bad men who left this ugly thing here will not hear us," she whispered, her breathing growing shallower by the second. "Can you be a brave, sleeping wolf for me, just until your father comes?" The mention of King Darius seemed to anchor the terrified child. Slowly, trusting the unwavering calm in her voice, Leo folded his small legs beneath him. He crouched down in the center of the snowdrift. pulling the heavy fur collar of his red coat up over his ears to block out the cold, and squeezed his eyes tightly shut. He did not make another sound. She watched his breathing slow, the immediate threat of a loud, dangerous panic successfully averted. Only when she was certain the child was secure in his silent game did she let her head fall back against the frozen pine needles. She closed her own eyes, finally allowing the toxic, radiating heat of the silver to pull her down into the merciful dark. King Darius Vaughan did not run, he hunted. The frozen earth of the whispering woods blurred beneath his heavy boots as he tracked the distressed scent of his only son. He had left the royal guards far behind, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that belonged strictly to the apex predator of the Northern Territories. The temperature had dropped sharply, hardening the mud into jagged ridges. Darius did not feel the cold. Then the northern wind shifted. It dragged a sudden, sickening odor through the bare branches, slicing straight through the familiar smell of damp pine needles and winter frost. Ozone. It was a sharp, metallic tang that burned the back of the throat. It was the chemical signature of outlawed silver reacting violently with warm blood. His knuckles cracked as his hands curled into fists. The rhythmic crunch of snow under his stride accelerated into a frantic sprint. He tore through a thicket of dead briars, ignoring the thorns that scraped against his jaw. The acidic stench of ozone grew thicker, now laced with the unmistakable sweetness of fresh copper and the bitter odor of burning flesh. His inner beast clawed at the edges of his consciousness, driven by a suffocating certainty. His air was bleeding out in the snow. When the smell hit its peak, his pupils dilated, swallowing the gold of his irises until his eyes were nearly black. He broke through a wall of frosted cedars. His boots skidding to a halt on the edge of a small, shadowed clearing, he stopped, the absolute stillness of a compass needle finding north. The pale winter sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting long, grey shadows over a disturbed mound of snow. Young Prince Leo sat perfectly unharmed. His bright red coat was pristine, vivid against the white drift. The small child was shivering violently, his small, gloved hands clutching desperately at the coarse grey wool of a servant's cloak. Beside the child lay the true source of the blood. Darius exhaled, a long cloud of white vapor escaping his parted lips as the immediate panic drained from his veins, leaving behind a cold, analytical clarity. He took a slow, measured step forward, the heavy tread of his boots shattering the eerie quiet of the clearing. The scent of singed skin was not coming from his air. It was rising from the dark, brutal machinery, clamped viciously around a young woman's lower leg. Darius processed the geometry of the violence instantly. The weapon was a massive, outlawed iron poacher's trap, its heavy springs thick with grease and rust. The teeth lining the jaws were dangerously bright, coated in a thick layer of weaponized silver designed to maim and poison heavily muscled wolves. The plating was jagged, meant to tear and lodge deeply inside the muscle tissue, ensuring the toxic metal remained in the bloodstream long after the iron closed. The feral fury that had propelled him through the forest abruptly dissolved, replaced by a profound, hollow shock. He locked eyes with the semi-conscious figure pinned to the freezing earth. Nellie Vance. He knew her name, though they had never exchanged a single word. She was the quiet girl who swept the great hall hearths before dawn, the one who moved through the fortress corridors with her head bowed, slipping seamlessly into the background. That was the kind of invisible she had become. Now that quiet architecture had fractured to save his lineage. She lay in the snow, her grey uniform soaked in a dark, spreading stain that melted a macabre crater into the pure white drift. The silver poisoning was actively spreading. He could see the dark, unnatural veins branching out from the wound, creeping up her calf like bruised ivy. It was an agony that usually sent grown, hardened warriors into fits of violent delirium. Yet she was biting down so fiercely on her own woolen sleeve that the fabric was tearing beneath her teeth. She was suffocating her own screams to keep the boy beside her calm. The sovereign's gaze shifted from the massive iron jaws back to the small frame of his son, and the brutal mathematics of the scene settled into his chest. Had the boy stepped onto the trigger plate, the silver-plated teeth would not have merely caught an ankle. They would have crushed the little cub's waist entirely, severing his spine in a single blow. She had not tripped. The angle of her body, the way the snow was violently ploughed backward, the protective curve of her arm still hovering near the prince. It all painted a precise, undeniable picture. The maid had thrown herself into the path of the snapping iron. She had taken a lethal, agonizing wound to spare a child who was not hers. The king dropped to his knees. The snow soaked instantly through his dark trousers, but he paid no attention to the cold. He did not issue a command. He did not demand an explanation from the weeping boy. Darius simply looked at the trembling woman. Her face was entirely drained of color. Sweat beaded along her hairline despite the freezing wind. Her breathing was shallow, forced through the barrier of her clenched jaw and ruined sleeve. The strict borders of hierarchy evaporated in the freezing air. The man who ruled the Northern Territories did not see a low-tier worker bleeding on the ground. He saw a warrior who had held the line when the royal guards had failed. "You are safe," Darius murmured. His voice was a low, steady rumble, carefully calibrated to project absolute security without a single trace of threat. He reached out, his large hands hovering just inches from the rusted iron. He did not touch her immediately. He waited for her glazed eyes to focus on his face, giving her the silent permission to understand who he was and what he was about to do. Nellie's chest hitched. Her fingers, stained with dirt and pine sap, twitched against the snow. She managed a microscopic nod, the movement so faint it was barely a tremor in the cold air. King Darius Vaughan did not waste time looking for a mechanical release. Nor did he wait for the arrival of his heavily armed border patrols. His immense frame blocked out the biting wind that howled through the whispering woods. The silver-toothed trap was a monstrous piece of outlawed engineering. Its thick iron springs were designed to withstand the thrashing of a fully grown wolf, heavily plated in toxic silver, so that whatever it caught would slowly rot. She knew the strict protocol for such devices. A specialized lever was required, or a heavy iron pry bar fetched from the keep's armory, operated by men wearing thick leather gauntlets. Instead, Darius reached out with his bare hands. Nellie's breath caught in a ragged, shallow gasp. Her vision was already swimming with the sickening, grey haze of the poison, yet she watched in absolute disbelief as the Alpha King wrapped his long fingers directly around the lethal, silver-laced springs. The reaction was brutal and instantaneous. A sharp, terrifying hiss sliced through the frozen silence of the forest, louder than the rustling branches above. Smoke immediately curled from beneath his gripping palms, carrying the acrid, metallic stench of burning flesh and searing ozone. The silver was reacting violently to the pure, undiluted blood of the sovereign, burning into his skin just as mercilessly as it was burning into her shattered ankle. "Your Majesty, no," the maid tried to whisper, the words barely scraping past her dry, trembling lips. "The silver." The king ignored her warning. He did not flinch, nor did he loosen his grip by a fraction of an inch. His jaw locked with such immense force that the muscles in his neck stood out like thick cords of carved granite. He was attempting the impossible, pitting his raw, biological strength against the cold, unyielding mechanical leverage of forged iron. The trap groaned in protest, emitting a high-pitched, metallic shriek that vibrated deeply through the frozen ground beneath Nellie's hands. The gravel bit into her palms like broken teeth, grounding her in the agonizing reality of the moment. She stared at the sovereign's face, expecting to see the wild, feral desperation of a cornered beast. Instead, she found a terrifying absolute control. Darius Vaughan occupied pain the way other men occupied silence, without apology, without the nervous impulse to escape it. The hissing of his burning flesh grew louder, the smoke thickening around his wrists, but his pale eyes remained entirely focused on the serrated teeth embedded in her leg. Slowly, millimeter by agonizing millimeter, the massive jaws began to part. The sheer physical torque required to force the springs open was unimaginable, yet his breathing remained impeccably steady. He was deliberately absorbing the agonizing poison of the silver into his own body, turning his own suffering into a calculated wedge to set her free. The moment the iron gap was wide enough, Nellie instinctively jerked her mangled leg backward, biting down on her lip until she tasted blood. The jagged silver teeth scraped brutally against her torn flesh one last time before she was finally clear. The instant her ruined boot was free of the mechanism, Darius released the springs. The trap slammed shut with a violent, final clang that echoed like a gunshot across the snow. He did not inspect his ruined, blackened palms, though the scent of burned skin lingered heavily in the frigid air. The Alpha King did not curse the rogue poachers or issue a single command to the empty woods. He simply shifted his weight in the snow, moving deliberately closer to her shivering form. Nellie's body was rapidly beginning to shut down. The aggressive shock of the silver toxin was crashing through her fragile system, dragging her core temperature toward a fatal, irreversible hypothermia. Her teeth clattered uncontrollably. Her spine bowing as a violent tremor racked her small frame. Before she could attempt the futile effort of dragging herself upward, Darius reached down. He did not shout for a medic or a stretcher. He did not wait for his elite guards to emerge from the distant tree line to carry the injured servant. He slid one large, blistering arm beneath her knees and the other firmly across her back, lifting her out of the blood-soaked snow with an effortless, fluid grace. He gathered her entirely against himself, refusing to delegate her care to anyone else, ignoring the blood that immediately began to stain his pristine royal garments. The sheer radiating heat of the Alpha King struck Nellie like a physical blow. It was a stark, overwhelming contrast to the icy grave she had been lying in just moments before. Darius pulled her shivering frame tightly against the broad expanse of his chest, wrapping the thick, heavy folds of his dark velvet and fur-lined cloak completely around her shoulders. He was sealing out the freezing northern wind, using his own immense body heat as a tangible barrier to slow the lethal chill creeping up her veins. "Hold still," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant vibration that rumbled directly against her cheek. It was not a royal command issued from a throne to a lowly maid, but a quiet, pragmatic instruction meant to anchor her failing consciousness. The sovereign turned and began the long journey back toward the towering stone spires of Vaughan Fortress, his strides long, steady, and entirely unhurried. Inside the heavy, insulated cocoon of his cloak, Nellie was shielded from the biting frost, surrounded by the deep, grounding sense of pine, cedar, and the faint, metallic tang of his burned hands. The violent tremors shaking her body slowly began to subside, replaced by a heavy, unnatural lethargy. The silver poison was spreading relentlessly, numbing her nerve endings and pulling her down into a suffocating darkness. Yet, as the edges of her vision turned a blurry, formless grey, she did not feel the crushing terror of dying alone in the woods. The rhythmic, powerful thud of the king's heart beneath the fur became the only sound that mattered. She rested her head weakly against his chest, letting the deep, controlled cadence of his breathing lull her into the dark, trusting the undeniable strength of the arms that held her as she finally slipped into a quiet, heavily guarded unconsciousness. The temperature shifted violently from the biting, ozone-laced frost of the whispering woods, to the dense, torch-lit warmth of Vaughan Fortress. The massive iron-studded oak doors groaned inward, yielding to the sovereign's unhurried but unstoppable momentum. Nellie hovered in a state of suspended clarity, her perception narrowed by the fiery pulse of the silver poisoning ravaging her lower leg. The toxic venom burned through her veins like liquid coal, making her shiver uncontrollably against the heavy wool of the king's coat. She kept her eyes half closed, anchoring her sanity to the heavy thud of his boots against the outer courtyard stones, which soon gave way to the sharp acoustics of the polished marble inside the grand entry hall. The keep's domestic machinery was usually a symphony of precise, invisible labor. Dozens of workers hurried across the expansive foyer, carrying armfuls of dry cedar, stacks of pressed linen, and heavy iron pots of winter stew. But the moment the Alpha King crossed the threshold, the entire hall oriented toward him, the way iron filings orient toward a lodestone. The bustling noise evaporated, replaced by the kind of silence that swallows words whole. Men and women stopped mid-step, their breaths plumbing faintly in the draught, their eyes widening at the impossible disruption of their rigid social reality. The sovereign was not just carrying an injured woman. He was carrying a low-status maid, her simple grey dress torn and saturated with dark, toxic blood. That same corrupted blood was rapidly seeping into the king's immaculate, fur-lined royal garments, smearing across the embroidered crest of his lineage. In a society bound by strict spatial boundaries and blood treaties, a servant bleeding upon a monarch was an offence punishable by immediate exile. Yet, Darius moved with a terrifying, absolute calm, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line that dared anyone to speak. Standing near the base of the grand staircase was Mrs. Althea Thorne. Head housekeeper was a woman composed of stiff posture and pragmatic efficiency, ruling the lower corridors with unquestioned authority. She had spent decades maintaining the pristine separation of the royal family from the working class. Now, watching her monarch march through the main gates, with one of her most invisible subordinates cradled against his chest, the older woman simply froze. Her mind, usually a ledger of logical calculations, could not process the structural violation happening before her eyes. The heavy silver key ring, the very symbol of Althea's meticulous control over the fortress, slipped from her slackened fingers. The metal struck the cold stone floor. The sharp, erratic clatter bounced off the vaulted ceilings, slicing through the stunned, breathless silence of the great hall. It was a chaotic, ugly sound in a space that demanded perfection, a physical manifestation of the rules fracturing in real time. Nellie flinched at the noise, a lifetime of conditioned obedience urging her to drop to the floor and apologize for ruining his royal coat. But the sovereign did not even break his stride, holding her tighter against his chest as he stepped past the fallen keys without a downward glance. "My king," Althea finally managed to choke out, her voice trembling as she recovered a fraction of her composure. "The lower infirmary. I will send for the servant healers immediately. We must get her out of your arms." Darius did not pause. He bypassed the arched corridor leading to the subterranean levels, where the damp, drafty medical cots for the working class were kept. Instead, he turned his boots toward the grand marble staircase, carrying the bleeding maid directly toward the restricted private royal wing. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. The royal wing was a sanctuary of political power and pure lineage, a place no servant entered unless specifically summoned for silent cleaning duties. Court healers and armored guards scrambled to follow him, their heavy footsteps rushing up the stairs in a chaotic wave of confusion. Nellie felt the atmospheric shift as they ascended, the air growing warmer, thicker with the expensive scent of melting beeswax, polished cedar and imported lavender. Her head fell back against the king's shoulder, the silver venom making her vision swim in grey, hazy patches. She could hear the frantic protests of an elder physician, demanding that the monarch put the contaminated girl down, warning that her toxic blood would foul the sacred halls. The sovereign ignored them all. Reaching the end of the long, portrait-lined corridor, he pushed open the heavy double doors to his personal bedchamber with his shoulder. The room was vast and quiet, dominated by an immense hearth and a massive four-poster bed draped in the finest winter pelts. Darius walked straight to the center of the room and laid Nellie down on his own heavy loom-woven wolf fur blankets. The contrast was jarring. Her mud-caked boots and ragged linen dress pressed into the pristine, silver-tipped furs. Almost immediately, the dark, toxic seepage from her mangled ankle soaked into the expensive fabric, leaving an irreversible stain on the symbol of his sovereignty. Nellie watched numbly as the dark red wetness spread. The training of a lifetime surged through her feverish panic. "The blankets," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. She tried to pull her leg back, dragging her ruined ankle off the mattress in a desperate attempt to save the bedding. "I'm ruining it. I shouldn't be here." He stopped her movement with a firm, incredibly gentle hand on her knee. He looked down at the ruined, priceless linens, then back to her pale, sweating face, his expression devoid of any concern for the material loss. The choice of placing a bleeding maid on the Alpha King's bed was a deliberate, undeniable political statement. It was a spatial declaration of her worth, overriding the protests of the court hierarchy that had gathered breathlessly in the doorway. "Let it ruin," Darius answered. His low voice carried a steady, terrifying authority that silenced the murmuring healers behind him. He did not step away from the bed, establishing a perimeter of absolute safety around the woman who had bled for his son. Awareness returned, not as a sudden awakening, but as a slow, agonizing drag through deep water. Nellie felt the heat first. It was not the thin, smoky warmth of the servant barracks, where winter drafts slipped through cracked mortar. This heat was absolute, radiating from a massive hearth and settling over her skin like a weighted physical object. The air smelled of rich cedarwood incense, aged pine oil, and the faint, unmistakable metallic tang of her own injured flesh. She tried to shift her weight. Years of harsh discipline had taught her to withhold her tears from those incapable of empathy. When the agony finally leveled into a dull rhythm, she carefully opened her eyes. The vaulted ceiling above her was intricately carved from dark polished oak. Heavy velvet tapestries hung along the walls, isolating the room from the rest of the fortress. This was entirely wrong. She lowered her gaze, her vision swimming in the feverish golden light of the sconces. Her right hand lay resting over the heavy bedcover. She moved her fingers tentatively, her rough knuckles brushing against a texture she had never encountered before. It was thick, impossibly soft fur. Royal sable, undoubtedly. It felt completely alien against her calloused, hard-working skin. The sheets beneath her were tightly spun linen, smelling of crushed lavender, and the crisp ozone of a mountain storm. The terrifying certainty lodged itself between her ribs like a sliver of cold glass. She was lying in the sovereign's private chamber, a low-ranking girl with dirt under her nails and venom in her blood, resting directly on King Darius Vaughn's personal mattress. She tried to push herself up, driven by the ingrained panic of an invisible worker caught out of her permitted jurisdiction. But a sudden, solid weight pressing near her uninjured knee stopped her completely. Nellie blinked against the rising haze, tilting her head slowly to look down. Curled into a tight, defensive knot at the very foot of the immense bed was Prince Leo. His distinctive red winter coat had been discarded somewhere across the stone floor, leaving him in a rumpled, grass-stained linen shirt. The young heir was asleep, but it was a restless, hyper-vigilant state. His dirt-smudged fists were clenched ruthlessly around the thick fur of her blanket, anchoring his body weight directly to her. Even in unconsciousness, his breathing hitched unevenly, his brow furrowed in a permanent, anxious scowl. The child had positioned himself exactly between her vulnerable body and the heavy oak door, instinctively acting as a physical barrier. Nellie let her head fall back against the down pillows. She lacked the physical strength to move him, and in the vast quiet of the royal room, the steady rise and fall of the boy's chest was the only thing keeping her tethered to the waking world. The heavy iron latch of the chamber door lifted with a soft metallic click. Nellie's breath hitched, but she could not sit up. The thick oak panel swung open just wide enough to admit Mrs. Althea Thorne. The head housekeeper moved with her usual brisk efficiency, her leather shoes making almost no sound on the woven rugs. In her hands, she carried a polished silver tray, bearing a small ceramic bowl of roasted venison, alongside a steaming mug of bone broth. The savory scent of rosemary and cooked meat cut sharply through the heavy cedar incense. The moment the scent hit the air, the heavy weight at the foot of the bed shifted violently. Leo did not simply wake up, he snapped into absolute primal awareness. The small prince pushed himself up on his hands and knees, scrambling backward until his small body was pressed flush against Nellie's injured thigh. His shoulders hunched forward in an unnatural, rigid line. The fine hairs on his arms stood on end, and a low, vibrating hum began to build deep within his chest. Mrs. Thorne paused mid-step, her practical eyes widening in surprise. She had raised 3 generations of royal pups in Vaughan Fortress, but she had never seen the young prince look quite like this. He was not throwing a typical royal tantrum, he was standing guard. "Your Highness," Althea began. Her voice kept deliberately low and soothing, adopting the tone one might use to approach a cornered wolf in the woods. "You must be hungry. You have been in this room for hours without a meal." She took one slow, measured step toward the edge of the mattress, extending the tray slightly as an offering. Leo's reaction was instantaneous. He bared his teeth, the tiny, blunt fangs of an unshifted pup glinting in the firelight. The low hum in his chest escalated into a genuine, guttural growl, a sound far too dark and serious for a child his age. His small hands tightened their death grip on Nellie's sable blanket, pulling it closer over her legs as if trying to hide her from the housekeeper's view. His wide, feral eyes tracked Althea's every micro-movement, refusing to break eye contact. "Prince Leo," the older woman tried again, setting the tray down on a nearby side table and holding her empty hands up in surrender. "No one is going to hurt her. I only wish to bring you food and to check the maid's bandages. You must let her rest properly." The boy did not care about logic. He did not care about the authority of the fortress staff. The trauma of the frozen forest, the terrifying snap of the iron jaws, and the smell of Nellie's blood had triggered a biological override. In his mind, the keep was no longer safe. The adults were no longer reliable, and this bleeding woman was the only pack member he trusted. He snapped his jaws in the air, a sharp, warning click of teeth, commanding the housekeeper to stay exactly where she was. Nellie watched the standoff through the blurred edges of her fever. The child was exhausting himself, running purely on adrenaline and terror. She knew she had to intervene before Althea felt compelled to call the guards to restrain him. Fighting the nausea that rolled through her stomach, the maid forced her right hand to move. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, traversing the vast distance of the mattress until her palm finally rested gently against the back of the boy's neck. Her touch was weak, barely a whisper of pressure, but the effect was immediate. Leo flinched at the sudden contact. As soon as he recognized her scent, the rigid tension in his spine began to fracture, and he settled back down against her uninjured leg. Once Althea had left the food and been quietly dismissed, the royal bedchamber settled into a heavy stillness, smelling intensely of crushed pine, dry earth, and the sharp, medicinal tang of winter willow bark. The heavy oak doors were firmly bolted from the inside. Beyond that thick wood, the most elite healers and apothecaries of the court waited in a nervous, murmuring cluster, their expertise entirely dismissed. King Darius Vaughan refused to let them cross the threshold. He had not carried a bleeding maid past his own guards, simply to hand her over to an indifferent medical hierarchy that treated servants as disposable assets. This was a debt of blood. He would not delegate its repayment. Nellie lay against the vast expanse of pristine white linen, the searing heat of the silver poisoning turning her vision hazy. Her breathing was shallow, carefully metered to prevent the agony in her leg from spiking into her chest. To Nellie, soundlessness had long been an invisible aegis, scant in substance yet easy to bear. She wore it now, refusing to whimper. Beside her foot, young Prince Leo had finally curled into a tight ball, deeply asleep and exhausted from his own fierce, protective vigil over her. Despite the fever, her attention was anchored to the far side of the room. Darius stood by the massive stone hearth, his broad shoulders illuminated by the low, dying embers. He worked over a heavy granite mortar. The rhythmic, grating sound of stone grinding against stone echoed off the cold walls. It was a slow, punishing sound. He did not rush. Darius drove the heavy pestle downward with methodical, terrifying precision. He was breaking down dried comfrey root, calculating the exact pressure needed to crush the tough fibers without turning them into useless dust. When the comfrey was properly prepared, he reached for a bundle of blackened willow branches. He snapped them with his bare hands. The sharp crack cut through the quiet room like a breaking bone. He crumbled the active charcoal between his fingers, the fine, dark soot, coating his knuckles and settling deep into the creases of his palms. These were hands that signed execution warrants, hands that held the sovereign weight of the Northern Territories. Right now, they were stained black with hearth ash and earth, performing the quiet, menial labor of a village herbalist. He measured the charcoal with a small brass spoon, avoiding any trace of silver, counting the exact proportions needed to bind the poison. The elites of the court would have been horrified to see the sovereign engaged in domestic, dirty labor. Yet, standing there with soot smeared across his forearms, he did not look diminished. He looked infinitely more dangerous. He was fighting the silver, moving through her veins with the same tactical ruthlessness he applied to border wars. The scent of the comfrey and charcoal paste deepened into a rich, heavy earthiness, a dark remedy engineered specifically to draw out the toxic burn of the trap's teeth. Nellie shifted on the mattress. A sudden, violent spasm tore through her calf as a shard of silver poison hit a nerve. Her breath caught in a sharp, involuntary hiss. The grinding stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Darius crossed the vast chamber before the breath had even left her lungs. He moved with the terrifying speed of his lineage, yet his footsteps were completely silent against the stone floor, careful not to wake the sleeping pup. He carried a shallow ceramic bowl, the thick black paste resting heavily at its center. The sovereign knelt beside the edge of the mattress, his broad frame stilled completely as he waited for her slight, shivering nod. Only then did he pull back the heavy wool blankets. The ruined, blood-soaked linen wrapped tightly around her lower leg was a stark, brutal reminder of the iron trap. He did not flinch at the sight of the mangled, poisoned flesh, nor at the violent purple bruising that had spread up toward her knee. He simply set the ceramic bowl on the bedside table and reached out. His massive, soot-stained hands hovered over her skin. Nellie instinctively braced herself, knowing the crushing weight of an alpha's physical presence. But when his fingers finally made contact with her leg, the touch was shockingly light. He held her ankle with a trembling grip. The tremor was not from fear or weakness, but from the supreme, agonizing physical effort of restraining his own immense strength. The man who could pry a bear trap open with his bare hands now held her scarred, swollen ankle as if it were made of spun glass. Carefully, meticulously, he used a damp cloth to cleanse the blackened, necrotic edges of the wound, washing away the dried blood. He did not rush the horrific process. When the flesh was clean, he scooped a measure of the dark paste with 2 fingers and pressed it directly against the open silver burns. The comfrey and charcoal paste was freezing against her burning skin. A second later, the chemical reaction began. A deep, violent pulling sensation radiated through her muscles as the activated charcoal latched onto the toxic silver particles embedded deep within her tissues. Nellie bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste copper. She stifled a whimper, refusing to cry out as the poison was forcefully drawn toward the surface. Darius's jaw tightened. He paused the application, his thumb moving to lightly stroke the uninjured arch of her foot. It was a silent, grounding gesture. He did not offer hollow apologies or promise that the pain would magically disappear, because they both knew the reality of silver. He simply stayed there, kneeling on the cold floor, grounding her through the worst of the chemical extraction. Slowly, ounce by ounce, he covered the entirety of the wound in the thick black earth. The agonizing, blinding white fire in her veins began to transition into a dull, heavy ache. The worst of the silver's heat was being smothered. She watched him carefully wrap fresh, clean linen around the poultice. He pulled the bandages with precise, even tension, securing the knot without putting pressure on the torn muscles. As the knot pulled tight, his broad shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. The worst of the crisis had passed. He remained on his knees, his breathing slowing to match hers. His soot-stained hands rested on the mattress just inches from her foot, leaving dark smudges against the pristine white bedding. He merely watched the steady rise and fall of her chest, the heavy silence of the room settling around them like a protective wall. Morning light crept through the tall, leaded glass windows of the royal bedchamber. It was not the freezing grey dawn she was accustomed to in the servant corridors, but a thick, golden illumination catching dust motes above the hearth. Nellie blinked. The fever had finally broken. Her mind was clear, stripped of terrifying dreams of iron teeth, leaving only the stark reality of her physical state. The heavy scent of willow bark, cold comfrey, and activated charcoal lingered in the fine linen sheets, a testament to King Darius's meticulous care. She pulled back the heavy wool blankets, the fabric reassuringly rough against her hands. The linen bandages binding her lower leg were partially loosened. Nellie stared at her ankle. The massive silver teeth of the poacher's trap had not merely cut her. They had burned through muscle and sinew, leaving deep, jagged starbursts of puckered tissue. The angry red of the fresh injury had faded, replaced by a mottled silver grey, where the toxic metal had altered her blood. It was a gruesome, geometric map of violence drawn onto her flesh. She ran her fingertips over the ridged scars. There was no magical reversal for this. While alpha wolves healed from ordinary steel lacerations in hours, silver was the terrifying equalizer. It corrupted and solidified, leaving necrotic dead zones no shifter resilience or rare herbal poultice could completely restore. The realization settled into her like cold water into stone, slow, thorough, filling every crack. A maid's worth in the fortress was measured entirely in motion. Her survival depended on carrying heavy buckets of lye up narrow stone stairs and scrubbing enormous hearths before dawn. A broken body meant uselessness. In the strict hierarchy of Vaughan Fortress, uselessness usually meant immediate dismissal into the harsh outer winter. She needed to know exactly what she had lost. Nellie gripped the heavy oak bedpost, knuckles whitening. She swung her legs over the edge of the mattress, dragging the injured limb with extreme caution. The cool air was sharp and waking. She took a slow, measured breath, mentally preparing for the pain, and lowered herself until her toes touched the cold stone floor. She pressed her weight down. The joint simply refused to hold. It was not the sharp, screaming agony of the initial bite, but a hollow, terrifying structural failure. Her ankle folded inward instantly. The severed muscles could not lock, and the scarred bone could not support the pressure. Nellie buckled. She caught herself before she hit the floor, palms slapping hard against the unyielding stone tiles. She knelt in the quiet morning light, breathing shallow and tight, hair falling forward to hide her face. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why. Instead, she stared at the cracked stone, absorbing the absolute finality of it. She would never walk without a severe limp again. The physical body that carried her through years of silent, invisible labor was fundamentally broken. The heavy iron latch of the oak door disengaged with a definitive click. Nellie did not scramble to hide her undignified position. She remained kneeling by the bed, her breathing rigorously controlled, her face locked into a mask of quiet endurance. King Darius Vaughan stepped into the room. He did not gasp or rush forward with frantic, useless pity. He carried his authority without the nervous impulse to dominate the quiet, occupying the space with unhurried calm. He crossed the floor with deliberate strides, his dark velvet winter cloak brushing softly against the stone tiles. He stopped beside her. He looked down at her awkward posture, the ruined leg stretched behind her, and the white-knuckled grip on the bed frame. He understood the grim mathematical calculation she had just performed regarding her future. Darius crouched smoothly, his knee nearly touching the stone. He did not grab her waist or hoist her like a helpless child. Instead, he extended his arm, offering a solid, immovable anchor. Nellie assessed the offer, then placed her palm against his thick forearm. With his unyielding support, she pulled herself back up and seated herself on the mattress, dragging the useless foot behind her. He remained standing before her, a towering figure of absolute authority. "The structural damage is permanent," Nellie said. Her voice was remarkably steady, devoid of self-pity. "I will not be able to carry the ash buckets. I will not be able to climb the servant stairs to the upper galleries." Darius watched her. His expression was impossible to read, save for the dark, intense focus of his eyes, tracing the resignation in her posture. He reached beneath the heavy folds of his cloak. When he withdrew his hand, he held a large forged iron ring carrying 3 heavy antique brass keys. The metal clinked softly, a sound of heavy doors and locked archives. He stepped closer and took her right hand, the knuckles rough and stained with the faint residue of old pine sap. He pressed the heavy brass ring directly into her palm. The keys were freezing. The cold metal bit into her skin, heavy and deeply substantial. "These open the eastern apartment in the upper keep," Darius said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "It has 3 rooms, a hearth that draws perfectly, windows that face the morning sun." Nellie stared at the keys. In Vaughan Fortress, a private apartment in the upper keep was reserved strictly for high-ranking council members and blood relatives of the sovereign. It was a space of undeniable privilege. "I do not understand," she said simply, her mind refusing to pass the logic. "You were calculating the timeline of your dismissal," Darius answered. It was not a question. He read her defensive posture perfectly. "You believed that. Because you can no longer perform the physical labor of a maid, you have lost your place in this fortress." He closed his large, warm fingers gently over hers, folding her hand securely around the brass. "The hands that saved my son will never hold a broom again," Darius said. The words were pressed into her memory like a seal into hot wax. It was not a conditional offer requiring submission. It was a statement of absolute, structural fact from the highest authority in the territory. "You are no longer a servant, Nellie Vance. You will not navigate the back stairs. You will not haul ash," he continued, his tone lowering into a solemn vow. You will reside in the eastern apartment, and you will walk through the main corridors of this keep. However slowly you need to walk, and every wolf in this territory will clear a path for you." Nellie looked from the heavy brass keys up to the king's face. There was no pity in his eyes. There was only the ferocious, respectful certainty of a sovereign who had weighed an impossible debt and found the only honorable way to repay it. She gripped the cold keys, feeling the jagged edges of the brass bite gently into her palm, and let the first true breath of safety she had ever known fill her lungs. While Nellie settled into the quiet realization of her new standing, the king's work was far from finished. The heavy oak door of the strategic archive closed with a solid, echoing thud, sealing away the quiet warmth of the royal corridors. Here the air smelled of stale beeswax, ancient parchment, and cold iron. Darius Vaughan stood at the head of the long map table. The silver-toothed trap sat directly in the center of a pristine vellum map of the ancient timberland. It was a mangled mess of heavy springs and jagged edges, its jaws staining the topographical lines with a mixture of melted snow and dried blood. His chief trackers stood frozen near the massive stone hearth, waiting for an explosion of royal fury that never came. Darius simply stared down at the machinery of near tragedy with a terrifying, unblinking focus. He reached out with a bare hand, ignoring the faint, stinging resonance of the silver plating that remained on the teeth. He ran his thumb over the main hinge. The metal was coarse to the touch. The blacksmithing was impatient. "Look at this weld," the king said, his voice dropping into a low, analytical register that made the trackers instinctively lean forward. He traced the crude, bubbling seam where the thick spring met the base plate. The iron was cooled too quickly in the forge. The silver plating is blistered and flaking at the outer edges. A guildmaster layers his silver to ensure it binds to the steel. This was poured hastily over the top to save coin, meant only to poison, not to last. Darius picked up a heavy brass caliper from the edge of the table and measured the gap between the jagged teeth. 3.5 inches, he noted, setting the tool down with a soft click. Standard border snares are strictly regulated at 2. This design is intentionally built to shatter the bone before it bites into the marrow, ensuring the prey cannot gnaw through its own limb to escape. He let that knowledge settle into the room. There is only one illicit operation in the northern sector cheap enough to botch a structural weld this badly, and arrogant enough to plant it a single mile from my fortress. The lead tracker swallowed hard, stepping up to the table. Garrick Brand. He runs a temporary camp near the neutral trading borders, sells the pelts on the black market. Darius nodded once, his eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight as he stared at the rusted metal. He did not order a massacre. He treated the offense as a profound legal violation of his territory's sovereign registry. Take 6 men. Do not draw your steel unless you are fired upon. I want him breathing. I want him fully capable of standing before the witness circle. He turned away from the table, the image of Nellie's bandaged ankle flashing behind his eyes. Saddle the horses. We ride immediately. The northern border camp smelled of wet ash, sour ale, and burning pine needles. The wind whipped through the skeletal branches of the dead trees, carrying the bitter, freezing sting of oncoming snow. Darius and his elite guard brought no screaming vanguard to announce their arrival. They moved through the freezing dark like shadows, utilizing the tactical silence of the deep woods. The poachers had pitched their ragged canvas tents in a narrow, rocky ravine, entirely confident in their isolation from the fortress patrols. Garrick Brand was laughing beside a dying fire, tossing a piece of hardtack to a mangy hound, when his perimeter guards simply ceased to exist. There were no shouts of alarm. There was only the heavy, muffled thud of bodies hitting the snow crust as the royal trackers systematically cleared the outer perimeter. Garrick realized the danger a fraction of a second too late. He scrambled backward, kicking snow over the glowing embers in a panic, and bolted toward the thickest part of the brush. He did not make it 5 yards. Darius moved with the unhurried speed of an apex predator executing a mathematical certainty. He intercepted the poacher at the edge of the clearing, blocking the escape path. Garrick swung a heavy, rusted skinning knife in a wild, desperate arc. Darius didn't dodge. He stepped cleanly inside the man's guard, grabbed a heavy iron fire poker resting against a nearby chopping block, and drove it forward with brutal precision. The blunt iron did not pierce flesh. It slammed directly through the thick, greasy wool of Garrick's sleeve, driving deep into the frozen bark of a fallen pine log behind him. Garrick jerked violently, pinned to the dead wood like a specimen on a board. He shrieked, anticipating the tearing of his arm, but there was only the immovable weight of the iron rod trapping his sleeve. Darius stepped into the poacher's personal space. His eyes had bled from their normal slate grey into a luminous, inhuman gold. The wolf beneath his skin clawed at the surface, screaming to rip the poacher's throat out for the innocent blood spilled in the royal woods. He slowly raised his hand. His knuckles popped sharply in the freezing air. His nails hardened into thick, dark claws. He pressed his hand against the side of Garrick's neck, the razor-sharp tips resting exactly 1 millimeter above the man's pulsing carotid artery. He did not draw a single drop of blood. The restraint was infinitely more terrifying than an outright attack. Garrick stopped breathing. The freezing air crystallized the sweat rolling down his filthy cheeks. "King Darius," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wheeze of absolute terror. "You set illegal iron in my woods," Darius said, his voice a soft, vibrating hum that rattled the frozen log. "You leave unregulated silver on my paths. You target my air." He leaned an inch closer, the scent of the man's profound cowardice filling the frigid air. "The beast in my chest wants to scatter your pieces across this ravine. Not because it demands violence, but because it demands balance." Darius held the claws steady, forcing the poacher to feel the lethal edge of the consequence. "But my son is learning how a sovereign governs, and the woman who bled to save him deserves the dignity of a public, documented reckoning." With a slow, deliberate exhale, Darius retracted his claws, the sharp points snapping back into smooth fingertips. He gripped the iron poker and ripped it free from the log, sending Garrick collapsing heavily into the slush. "Bind his hands." Darius ordered the trackers, who emerged silently from the surrounding shadows. "And keep him warm. He has an appointment in the Great Hall." The Great Hall of Vaughan Fortress smelled heavily of beeswax candles, polished wood, and cold iron. High-ranking lords filled the tiered wooden benches, their heavy fur cloaks rustling in the drafty air as they leaned forward to get a better look. At the center of the vast, shadowed chamber, Garrick knelt on the icy stone floor. Heavy iron chains bound the rogue poacher's wrists and ankles, locking him in a rigid, kneeling posture. He kept his chin tucked, his breathing shallow, surrounded by the silent fury of the court. The men who had failed to protect the borders now sat in judgment, their expressions hardened by guilt and a thirst for retribution. A heavy iron latch clattered at the far end of the chamber. The towering oak doors at the back of the hall swung open, letting in a sudden, biting rush of northern wind that caused the candle flames to flicker and dance. The low, rumbling murmurs of the assembled lords ceased instantly. Nellie stepped across the threshold. She wore a simple dress of dark wool, clean and perfectly tailored, but it was not the fabric that drew the court's collective attention. It was her rigid posture. She moved forward with a carved wooden cane gripped tightly in her right hand, her knuckles white with effort. Click, thump, click, thump. The sound of the solid wood striking the ancient stone floor echoed sharply against the vaulted ceiling. Every head turned. Every eye in the massive room tracked the slow, deliberate rhythm of her approach. She did not rush. She could not rush. Her right foot dragged slightly with every step, encased in a soft leather boot that could not completely hide the thick, jagged contours of the scarred tissue beneath. Mutinous functioned as her steadfast shield, flawed, perhaps, yet it demanded no physical toll. Nellie wore it perfectly, keeping her gaze fixed straight ahead. She focused entirely on the geometry of the room, measuring the physical toll of each movement against her own endurance, refusing to acknowledge the staring crowd. The silence in the hall grew absolute, pressing inward from the cold walls. It was not the quiet of simple curiosity. It was the crushing weight of collective realization. These were the elite warriors of the Northern Pines. They possessed heightened senses, massive physical strength, and ancient lineage. Yet, as the steady rhythm of her cane continued to echo, the truth became undeniable. Their royal guards had failed. The only reason the young heir was safely asleep in the royal chambers was because a low-status, wolfless maid had thrown her own fragile body into the jaws of a silver-toothed trap. King Darius Vaughan stood at the head of the hall. He did not sit on the heavily carved oak throne. He stood waiting at the edge of the raised dais, his hands clasped firmly behind his back, his dark eyes anchored entirely on the approaching woman. He watched the strain in her shoulders and the careful placement of her cane. He did nothing to rush her, offering no pity, only a deep, anchoring respect that commanded the rest of the room to do the same. When she finally reached the front of the dais, she did not kneel. Her damaged ankle would not allow it, and the king had already explicitly forbidden the gesture. She simply stopped, adjusted her weight onto the wooden staff, and waited for the law to be executed. Darius turned his attention back to the kneeling prisoner. The sovereign's voice did not rise in volume, yet it filled the massive stone chamber, vibrating against the frost-covered window panes high above. Garrick. The name fell flat and absolute against the cold stones. The poacher flinched violently, the chains rattling in a panicked rhythm against the floor tiles. He did not dare to look up at the dais. The registry of the Vaughan pack dictates the borders of this territory, Darius stated, his tone carrying the precise, unyielding weight of administrative law. He gestured to an open ledger, resting on the wooden podium beside him. You laid unauthorized iron within the sovereign boundary. You lined the hidden jaws with silver, a toxic weapon explicitly outlawed by the Blood Treaty of the North. Garrick swallowed hard, his shoulders curling further inward under the oppressive, collective stare of the watching elders. You hunted for gold, and you nearly claimed the life of Prince Leo, Darius continued, his voice dropping into a colder, deadlier register. The penalty for this violation is absolute. The king did not shout. He did not display the chaotic, feral dominance typical of a challenged alpha looking for a brutal public display. Instead, he utilized the crushing, inescapable machinery of the court. Your name is struck from the registries, he declared, his voice leaving no room for appeal. Your accomplices have already been driven beyond the frozen rivers. You are permanently exiled from these lands. If your scent crosses the border markers again, the guards will not bring you to this hall. They will simply end you. The guards stepped forward immediately. They hauled the criminal roughly to his feet by the chains. The poacher scrambled to find his balance, his face pale with terror, completely stripped of his rank and identity. As he was dragged backward down the center aisle, his boots scraped frantically against the stone, but the court offered no mercy. The towering oak doors opened, swallowing him into the biting winter storm outside, and slammed shut with a definitive, hollow thud. The sharp tension of the sentencing slowly drained from the air, replaced by a profound, heavy realization that settled over the packed benches. An elder lord, a man with graying hair who had spent years ignoring the invisible servants of the keep, stepped out from the front row. He wore the heavy silver medallions of the High Council draped over his fur cloak. Nellie recognized him instantly. She had served him hot, spiced wine countless times over the years, and he had never once looked at her face. The elder stopped 3 paces away. He did not look up at the sovereign. He looked directly down at her scarred leg, then up to meet her steady, observant eyes. Slowly, deliberately, the High Lord bowed his head. He bent deeply at the waist, exposing his neck in the traditional gesture of profound pack submission. It was a staggering breach of normal hierarchy, a high-ranking shifter willingly bowing to a wolfless maid in front of the entire assembly. "We are in your debt," the elder said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Your human blood preserved the lineage of this pack. We will not forget." Behind him, the rustling of heavy fabric rippled through the chamber. One by one, the other lords and council members stepped forward out of their rows. They did not speak, but the movement was entirely unified. Row after row of the most powerful men and women in the territory bowed their heads toward the quiet woman with the cane. She stood leaning on her wooden support, feeling the rough bark pressing against her palm. She did not shrink back from the overwhelming display. She simply watched the geometry of the room shift forever, letting the reality of their respect settle in her chest like a stone dropping through still water. The great hall held its breath as the heavy oak doors closed behind the exiled poacher, sealing the verdict into the stone itself. Nellie stood near the dais, her weight resting firmly on the carved wooden cane. Her ankle throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, a permanent echo of the silver-toothed iron, but she did not shift her posture. She watched the high-ranking lords and elders of Vaughan Fortress, men who had walked past her for years without registering her existence, now keeping their heads bowed in absolute deference. King Darius Vaughan did not dismiss the council. Instead, he gestured to the chief archivist, who stepped forward from the shadows, holding a wide tray of polished cedar. Upon it lay a fresh, heavy sheet of vellum, untouched and pristine. Darius descended the 2 steps from his throne. He moved with the slow, measured grace of a predator who had nothing left to hunt, stopping exactly 1 pace from where she stood. He reached for the quill resting on the tray. The scratch of the nib against the thick parchment was the only sound in the cavernous room. Ink dried faster than tears in the bitter northern wind, and the words he wrote were destined to outlast them all. It was the Royal Hearth Guardian Decree. For centuries, the title had been left dormant, a sacred rank reserved only for the one who held the absolute trust of the Alpha King and the physical safety of the royal bloodline. It was not a title of servitude. It was a title of sovereignty. It meant she was untouchable by any beater, elder, or councilman. It meant her place in the fortress was structural, codified, and permanent. Darius finished writing. He set the quill down and picked up a small obsidian blade. Without hesitation, he drew the sharp edge across the center of his own palm. A single drop of dark alpha blood fell, striking the parchment just beside her newly written name. The archivist immediately poured melting red wax over the blood. The scent of hot beeswax and deep metallic copper filled the cold air. Darius pressed his heavy golden signet ring into the cooling pool, sealing the mixture of wax and royal blood into the very fiber of the decree. He lifted the heavy document and held it out to her. Nellie looked at the golden seal. She had spent her entire life learning how to shrink, how to blend into the grey stones of the servant corridors, how to calculate her survival in handfuls of oats and stolen moments of warmth. That was the kind of invisible she had become. Now, holding the heavy parchment, she felt the undeniable weight of her own existence. Darius Vaughan occupied silence, the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. He did not demand gratitude. He simply waited for her to accept what was already undeniably hers by right. She took the decree. The parchment was rough against her scarred hands, solid and real. Hours later, the crushing weight of the court's formality fell away, replaced by the deep, insulated quiet of the royal private chambers. The storm outside battered the thick glass windows, throwing sheets of freezing sleet against the fortress walls, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning cedar and dried lavender. Prince Leo was already asleep. The 5-year-old heir lay sprawled across the massive hearth rug, his small chest rising and falling in an even, peaceful rhythm. He had dragged his favorite fur blanket directly between where his father sat and where Nellie rested, instinctively positioning himself in the safest geometry the room could offer. Nellie sat in a high-backed armchair near the fire. The adrenaline of the trial had completely drained from her blood, leaving behind the deep, heavy exhaustion of a body that had survived the impossible. Carefully, she lifted her damaged leg and placed her foot onto a velvet-upholstered footstool Darius had positioned near the flames. She pulled back the hem of her woolen skirt, just enough to check the bandages. The skin beneath the linen was forever altered, mapped with jagged, silvery scars where the iron teeth had crushed muscle and vein. The comfrey and charcoal paste had drawn out the lethal poison, saving her life, but the limp would never fade. It was a physical truth she would carry for the rest of her days. A shadow moved across the firelight. Darius stepped into her peripheral vision, his footfalls entirely silent against the thick carpets. He did not ask about the pain. He could smell the faint trace of inflammation, could read the tight line of her jaw. Instead of offering hollow sympathies or magical promises, he responded with practical warmth. He unclasped his own personal's winter cloak, a massive heavy mantle of dark wool lined with thick wolf fur. Moving with deliberate, unhurried care, he draped it over her shoulders. The fabric was incredibly heavy, retaining the immense, comforting heat of his body. It settled over her like a physical barrier against the harshness of the world, wrapping her in the scent of pine, ozone, and safe earth. Darius did not hover. He pulled a wooden chair close to the hearth, sitting beside her rather than standing over her. He rested his elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on the dying embers, giving her the space to simply breathe. Silesmite had always been Nellie's armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. She had worn it to survive the bitter winters, the dismissive nobles, and the terrifying jaws of the savage wilderness. But as she watched the firelight dance across Leo's sleeping face, and felt the steady, protective presence of the king sitting quietly at her side, the armor began to slip away. She did not need it here. The cold stone of her past had been replaced by the enduring heat of the hearth. The contract of her survival had been rewritten in blood and wax. She leaned her head back against the chair, pulling the heavy fur-lined cloak a little tighter around her neck. Tomorrow, there would be ledgers to organize, medicines to brew, and a young prince who would undoubtedly insist on walking at her measured pace through the safe inner courtyards. But tonight, there was only the fire, the quiet breathing of her chosen family, and the profound, undeniable certainty that she was finally home.